Okay. Wenyan, unmute. Hi, Wenyan, just unmute yourself.
Yes, okay. I successfully unmuted myself. Good afternoon, or in case you are in a different time zone, maybe good evening, good morning. Welcome to the webinar that's organized by the Division for Inclusive Social Development of DESA. We have a very interesting presentation by a very well-known expert. But before we move to the presentation, let me just give you a very brief kind of introduction to the context of today's webinar. You see that we know that in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, eradication of poverty is goal number 1, SDG 1. Of course, to successfully eradicate poverty, we really need to understand the dynamics of poverty. People move in and out of poverty. Obviously, we want to move people out of poverty and permanently out of poverty. So we need to understand the dynamics. And of course, when we examine the dynamics, we need to understand the concepts of vulnerability to poverty and its opposing sides, that is economic security, right? So, when we discuss eradication of poverty and moving people out of poverty and keeping people out of poverty, we talk about the reaching the status of middle class. Middle class can be seen as the aspiration of our efforts, right? For people who are living in poverty to successfully move into the middle class, where they are no longer so vulnerable to falling into poverty. And also, we know from lots of studies that middle class is really the bedrock of a society in terms of supporting economic growth and supporting democratic institutions and all those good things in society. So that it is a very I would say the kind of positive side of looking at the poverty eradication effort to look at middle class. What makes middle class tick, and what kind of societal or economic societal forces that might affect the status of middle class. So, and this is closely related to the topic that we would like to explore in the next issue of the World Social Report. So therefore, this webinar is serving the broader purpose of examining an issue that's very important, very central to the Sustainable Development Goals, and at the same time a very practical purpose for our division. That is, we will take the leads in preparing the next issue of our department's flagship publication, the World Social Report. And then the topic is going to be on economic insecurity. And then, of course, the topic is also very timely in the context of the pandemics that we are in the middle of, so that the huge economic and social impact of the pandemics. So how this is affecting the middle class. So today we are very pleased and very honored to have Mr. López-Calva to talk about the concept of middle class from the perspective of economic insecurity, and with evidence data from Latin America. And this will include the impact of the pandemic so that, as I said, this is a very important and very timely discussion we'll have today. So just very briefly, Mr. López-Calva is a very accomplished expert. So just to highlight that he's the ASG in the UNDP office. He's the UNDP Regional Director for Latin America and the Caribbean since 2018. He has many years, close to 30 years of professional experience advising Mexican governments and working in international organizations, including UNDP, the World Bank, and being an advisor in the Bank of, the Europe and Central Asia region, and being in very important. And then you can see the Mr. López-Calva's bio with the link that was provided with the webinar. So I will just very briefly highlight his experience, and his research interests focus on labor markets, poverty and inequality, institutions, and microeconomics of development. And then we are very pleased to have him to share his insights with us today. Before I hand the floor over to Mr. López-Calva, I just want to go over, now I think lots of us are familiar with the logistical kind of details of a webinar, online webinar. That is that you can use please use the chat box to raise questions. When the speakers you can start entering your questions when the speaker is making the presentation, and we actually muted your microphones just so that to silence unnecessary background noise. So you really need to use the chat box to enter your questions. And also the presentation will be about 20 minutes. We have 1 hour for today's webinar, so that we would first hear the presentation by Mr. López-Calva, and then after his presentation, we would go into a dialogue, question and answer discussion, so that just to kind of manage the flow of the webinar. If you have a question in the nature of clarification about something, of the presentation, you can indicate so in your question in the chat box. We would accommodate such clarification questions. Otherwise, all the other discussions we will reserve till after the presentation. So without further delay, now it's my pleasure to invite Mr. López-Calva to make his presentation. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to you have seen the topic of today's webinar in the flyer, so the presentation will be on that. Thank you very much, and you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Wen-Yan. I want to really thank you and the whole team that is organizing this series. It is really a great opportunity for me to be able to make this presentation, and I just want to start by clarifying to the audience that I asked for permission not to wear a tie from Wen-Yan, because we wanted to make it a very informal conversation, and the idea is precisely to really have an open discussion on these issues. So what I will present is part of the work that I have been doing for now for quite some time, like 10 years, on these issues of vulnerability and poverty and middle class. And the idea is to tell you the motivation, the methodology, and then open for a conversation. So I will be make sure that I don't go over time. make sure that we have time to discuss. So first of all, there are, when I was in UNDP before going to the World Bank, that was in 2007 or so, we started one project, and there was a very interesting question in the sense of what does it mean to succeed in terms of economic policy. So this was before SDGs, before all that conversation, and of course we had the tradition of UNDP in terms of human development, but we were trying to find one indicator that could tell us whether you had succeeded. So one possibility was to talk about poverty reduction as the objective. But then we looked into the literature on middle classes, and then we thought, I mean, all this since Aristotle and many thinkers, the idea that societies that are sustainable in a multidimensional sense tend to have strong middle classes. So eventually the idea was, what I was thinking with the team was to try to connect these two. In both cases, both in the area of middle classes and in the area of vulnerability, I really learned a lot from the work of Nancy Birdsall, who presented in a previous seminar. So I want to say that I have benefited a lot from her work and conversations with her when I was visiting WIDER in Helsinki in 2012. We were working on these issues and having a very fluid conversation. So this is a little bit of the motivation in terms of why we started, I mean, I started working on this. Let me find out how to go move to the next slide. Let me see. I'm stuck. Okay, good. So the plan, I will talk a little bit very briefly about the progress that LAC achieved in the first, let's say, 16 years of this, 15 years of this century, starting in 2002 mainly, then a little bit about what are the challenges in terms of vulnerability. And more important, I think, for this conversation is the conceptual discussion on vulnerability out of poverty and how that relates to middle class. So first, Latin America has succeeded in many respects in terms of social advancement in the last 20 years or so, but one of the indicators is the reduction in poverty. You see here that there has been a very important reduction in terms of poverty, and I mean, accompanied, of course, by a cycle of economic growth. However, as we know, Latin America is not precisely a region of very dynamic economic growth. This graph should be dynamic, but it doesn't work in WebEx, but it will show you how LAC has a very mediocre growth pattern when compared to other regions. Latin America's growth cycle, and this is something you know well, is very much linked to the prices of commodities. So it's commodity driven. So what we experienced during the first part of the century was a positive cycle in terms of price of commodities, and that benefited the region very much with all the microeconomic implications that that has. For example, the idea that typically a commodity boom tends to distort, relative prices in favor of non-tradables. And in that sense, it has also increases, if non-tradables are more intensive in unskilled labor, it also increases the demand for unskilled labor, and that explains in part the reduction in the wage premium and then the reduction in inequality in income that we observe in household service. So in a way, it's driven by the cycle, and there are other elements in that process. But Latin America is a region, as we know, in need of economic diversification if we want to have higher rates of growth. Slow reduction in inequality, as I explained before, related, among other things, if it's okay, I can change my slide, don't worry, thank you. This is a reduction, very small reduction in economic inequality. Latin America continues to be the most unequal region in the world. And this graph, which was also supposed to be dynamic, but is not, you can see in 2005, the negative slope of this growth incidence curve. You have the poorest people here on the left, the relatively less poor people on the right, and I don't say rich people because these are not rich, are really just non-poor, because the richest people are not in the surveys, as we know. And this graph, as you move over time towards 2015, this would become flatter, and even the slope would change and become more so I'm told that the slides are not moving. Why would that be? If somebody help me on the technical side.
If you let me know, I'm able to change them from where I'm at. So if you just say next slide, I'll move them forward. Right now we're on slide 3.
Why is it that I cannot change them?
I'm not. If you look on the far left of the screen, there's a oval, a long oval, and in the middle there's a number arrows up and down, and you can change the page number step.
Yeah, that's what I'm using, and I'm in number 7. But
okay, I'll queue up to. I'm not sure why it's not working on your end. I'm very sorry.
Okay, thank you. So the idea is that this become flatter and eventually positively sloped, which means basically that growth was becoming less and less progressive. Next slide, please. But given this cycle of growth, many people were celebrating the fact that Latin America was becoming a middle-class society. So we saw books, papers. We saw a book in Mexico, for example, about the new middle class and so on. So the idea was, well, Latin America is becoming a middle-class society. And then if we go to the next, that was actually true. To the next slide, please. That was actually true for the whole world. There was this article in The Economist that I always use, that if you see the title about, the middle class in Africa growing, and you see the picture, there is something that doesn't match, right? It's not the idea you would have of a middle class. So something was, suggesting that the thresholds used, in this case by Martin Rebellion, to measure middle class, which was basically those who are not poor in a developing country, but they are still poor in a developed country, and trying to find those thresholds. I mean, it was not intuitively a good indicator. So we started thinking about how to better measure what it meant to be middle class, and not only living poverty, but actually becoming middle class. The next slide, please. So that's why I started to think about the links between this idea of economic security and the middle class, that eventually came this paper in the Journal of Economic Inequality, and the methodology that now is used in the World Bank and many other places for absolute measure of middle class based on vulnerability. Next slide, please. So it doesn't really come from interest in measuring class per se, but we looked at the literature on class. And at the end, class is about income. I mean, originally in the Roman Empire, the idea was to have a classes, a group, an income group, so that people could contribute according to their income to the government. I mean, to the state rather. So in that sense, you had an income classification, and you belonged to a certain classes, which basically is the original idea of class. The poorest people who couldn't contribute because they didn't have any wealth, they could only contribute by sending their kids to the army, and the kids in Latin is the proletariat, the prole rather. So the proletariat, the concept of the proletariat was those who could only contribute by sending their kids to the army because they didn't have any wealth. But we know that over time, the concept of class has turned rightly into a more complex idea in sociology, and it goes beyond income. So let's go to the next one, please. So actually, if we go back to Weber, class relates not only to the strict economic element, which is the classes, but also the status related to cultural consumption or consumption patterns, for example, but also power, which basically means your position in the distribution of power in society. So in a way, class includes all these elements. And that's why it becomes very difficult to measure in the sociological sense, because you have all these different elements and which are difficult to measure. So let's go to the next, please. I'm checking my time because I have only 10 minutes left. So in sociology, as you know, there are the traditional categories of Goldthorpe, in which they tend to use this occupational status. Why occupational status? Because in a way, there is some Marxist influence here. The occupational status, because it is related to your income, the classist component, is related to your status, but it's also related to the distribution, to your position in the distribution of power, because it has to do with your relation to the ownership of means of production, right? Whether you have capital or you have only labor. So Goldthorpe developed this methodology based on occupational status. But let's go to the next one, and we'll see that if we look at that in Chile, for example, this is the measure of income. So these are Goldthorpe's occupational categories. This is something we did for the report in which I collaborated with Chico Ferreira at the World Bank. This is income, okay? So this is the average, and this is the highest and the lowest level of income. So you can see that there is a lot of overlap here. So you can be in a Goldthorpe associated higher class, let's say a self-employed farmer or so, and you can be a self-employed without employer and have exactly or similar levels of income, okay? So for an economist, that doesn't work well because you want to have a notion of directional mobility. What does it mean to move up? Plus, if you use occupational status, there's a lot of structural change in the economy that could drive apparently social mobility, but it's actually driven by the structural change in society. So let's go to the next one, please. So then, next step is, let's think about this notion of what does it mean to be middle class? Well, one possibility is to just ask people, do you consider yourself middle class? And the other is objectively. And objectively, we had a relative way to look at it, which is not very interesting, but it's useful. But conceptually, it's just those who are in the middle, right? That's a relative approach. So every society has a middle class because there are some people in the middle of the distribution. But then the absolute approach means that there is something that is related to an absolute notion. So think of this, and I will ask you to think of this in the analogy to poverty. We know that in Europe, for example, poverty is measured as some share of the median income of the distribution. It's a relative approach. So even in rich societies, you have poor people, but it's a relative approach. Rather, in developing countries, we are more concerned about the absolute approach to poverty, which means you do not have the means to achieve a basic level of welfare. So let's go to the next one, please. We're going to think it along the same way for middle class. So there is a lot of literature that looks at the relative concept and defines different thresholds based on positions in the percentiles in the distribution. And then you have all this literature on that. Next one, please. If you go to the absolute, which is the one I'm more interested in here, you see that, for example, Banerjee and Duflo or Ravalion have these thresholds that led to the article in The Economist that I just mentioned at the beginning. So if you take these thresholds, absolute thresholds, in a period of economic expansion, you could see the middle class falling, for example, in the case of Mexico. So these thresholds, again, I insist on that, they didn't seem to make sense from an intuitive notion. Of course, Homi, Karas, Brookings have proposed a different threshold that is more similar, even though without the conceptual background that I will present now. Next one, please. So let's go to the next one. So let's go to the vulnerability notion. We're going to be in the realm of absolute measures of middle class. And the idea is that we will define middle class, next one please, as those who are not only not poor, but they are actually beyond a certain level of vulnerability. So they have economic security. Why? Because we want a concept that isolates the economic dimension of class. That doesn't mean that we are capturing the whole notion of class, but we are capturing the economic dimension of class. Second, if we care about poverty, which is actually the motivation, we want to make sure that we are saying something meaningful in terms of directional mobility, when you are moving up and when you're moving down. Third, in the desiderata, is that it is relevant from a public policy perspective. And finally, that it can be applied in different contexts, and maybe you will derive different thresholds, but the concept behind that is the same. Let's go to the next one, please. Then we come to the analogy again with poverty. So in poverty, the basic capability, or rather the basic functioning that you define is, for example, achieving, if you talk about extreme poverty, is achieving basic nutritional status. If you don't have enough means to have the certain caloric intake, that is the functioning you are defining, then you are poor in absolute terms. So in middle class, we're going to have the same analogy, but for a notion of economic security. If you don't have enough means to be economically secure when there is a shock, then you are not middle class, you are vulnerable, okay? Even if you are not poor. And this is the concept that makes the whole difference. So it is absolutely in the sense of the functioning that defines it, economic security, but it is relative in terms of the context. Economic security will be achieved through different means in different contexts, which means basically the thresholds of income might change. Next one, please. The next one, actually, this is a bit repetitive, so let's go to the next one. First step to measure that empirically, and that's the methodology in the paper. I have 4 minutes left, so I want to try to move fast. First step, very basic, you build transition matrices. In the first seminar of this series that probably you attended, it was all about the dynamics of poverty. So it's precisely that. So you have panel data, you look those who left poverty, those who fell into poverty, and so on. And then you have basically a process of transitions in and out of poverty. That's first step. Second, next one, please. Second step is you run a basic model of probability of falling into poverty based on those matrices, as explained or as correlated with a set of characteristics, of course, okay? And you find the betas that determine that process. Next one, please. Then you run an income model with the same characteristics. So you have a model for probability of falling into poverty, and you have a model of predicted income based on those same characteristics. And the third, and the final step is next one, please. You basically put in a graph the two things that you found for all people, right? So this is probability of falling into poverty, and this is level of income. Then we went to long-term studies using panel data, and we see that on average, 10% of people fall in and out of poverty. And this is a discussion we had with colleagues like Peter Lanja and so on, because they wanted to go more about the marginal probability and not the average probability, sorry. And I'm using average probability here. And then the average probability is 10%. So we said, so let's look at 10% probability of falling into poverty, which is sort of the steady state probability, and see what is the level of income associated to that probability. And that's how we get to the $10 per person PPP. We did it for a few countries, and it is surprisingly consistent in terms of this threshold, okay? Next slide, please. Then how do we go about the upper threshold? Well, we basically find the point in which the income distribution becomes really flat, okay? Mm-hmm. becomes really flat, and then it doesn't really make the sensitivity analysis very obvious. If you change this threshold, the size of the middle class changes very little because there is very little mass here in the distribution, okay? So basically you are gonna have now in the society, you're gonna define it as those who are poor on the left-hand side, those who are vulnerable because they are not poor, but they are not economically secure, and those who are a middle class. And you have a very relatively small class, which is sort of the top class. Next one, please. So we did this recently, by the way, this exercise in a report for Europe that was then also taken by the OECD with my good colleague Maurizio Busolo and Jonathan Kraber. And we found, for example, that in Europe, this relationship between income per capita and probability has shifted in the case of Europe. This is very consistent with the OECD report in the sense that for the same level of income in Europe, you have a higher probability of falling back into poverty. So that, in a way, the middle class has become more vulnerable. Can we go to the next one, please? Do you hear some background noise on my side?
No.
Okay, good, because my son is having a basketball class online, if that is possible. Anyway, okay, so given
and
this,
also just you
yes.
you can have a few more minutes. You don't have to rush.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So
Yeah.
I'm going to take 5 more minutes or so.
Yeah.
But I think the methodology, unless I'm told differently when we discuss, I think I managed to explain the methodology more or less clearly. So once you define this method and the different income groups, then there's a lot of analysis that you can do. For example, we looked into the non-economic dimensions of this, and this is unrelated to the slide you are seeing, but it's something that I didn't have in the presentation. So we published a paper in the Journal of Globalization and Development, looking at whether, for example, people who are in the middle class indeed change their values with respect to democracy, with respect to rights of minorities, and so on, to try to validate the political science discussion about the sort of the value system of the middle class. We found little evidence for that. We found rather that values are related to income, but not necessarily with a discrete change as you become middle class. So our conclusion, and it could be discussed, is that middle class is rather pragmatic more than necessarily normative based. But that's a different type of political economy discussion. Next one, please. So now we can respond the question for LAC, which was, is Latin America becoming a middle class society? In our report in 2012, this was exactly replicated but updated in a report published by UNDP in 2016, in which actually my co-author Eduardo Ortiz participated. And it's so they did basically an update of this, and the idea is no. Latin America is not a middle class society yet. It's in the process of becoming one, but actually it is rather a vulnerable society. Here, now you can see these numbers. It depends on how you weight the data and so on. I think this LAC Equity Lab is a bit generous in terms of the weighting. Actually, you know, the more or less the standard is that about 38 to 40% of the population in LAC is not poor, but they are vulnerable. So in that sense, the important thing is that the mode of the distribution in LAC is vulnerable. It's not middle class. The good news is that it's not poor either, but it is not middle class yet. The next one, please. So that means that in this process of economic growth, there were many people who actually left the poverty condition, but they didn't become middle class. What does that mean? Many things. One related to, as I said, we wanted something to be policy relevant. So one element is you need to strengthen social protection mechanisms to protect those who are vulnerable. And the other is there is some productivity threshold that people are facing. For some reason, they don't go beyond a certain level of income generation capacity. Next one, please. So I'm going to make a few comments. This is just a profile of middle class. Typically, the vulnerable are informal. Typically, they have no access to medical services. They don't have access to contributory pensions. They have unstable employment contracts and so on, as you would expect in a region that actually has, in some cases, even 60 or higher level, 60% or even higher levels of informality in the labor market.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about COVID briefly, and we close with that. Next one, please. So let's go to the next very quickly. If you see LAC, we are overrepresented in the world in terms of COVID impact. We have 7 countries in the top 10 countries with the highest number of cases and deaths. So you see here the red dots are countries in LAC. These are high-income countries, upper middle income, lower middle income. As you know, for low-income countries, the pandemic has basically not reached them yet. I don't know if it will, but certainly we see that in these groups of countries, in terms of middle income and high income, which is basically this case, of course, is Panama and the other is Chile, we have Latin American countries. Next one, please. Same with deaths. I mean, we're massively overrepresented. Next one, please. So bottom line, Latin America has 9% of the world population and 42% of daily new COVID cases in the recent weeks, which is, again, it shows you how much Latin America has been impacted. That has an economic side as well. Please go to the next. All the vulnerability, as I said in a recent article, the same way in which people with pre-existing conditions suffer more from the virus, economies with pre-existing conditions are being hit more harshly from the pandemic. In this case, the idea of vulnerability, high inequality, high vulnerability societies are being hit really harshly. Let's go to the next one, please. So we're going to be the hardest hit region in the world, according to IMF. Very severe contraction. In Mexico yesterday, the central bank made an update saying that the economy might contract 13%, which is huge and certainly unprecedented in recent economic history for Mexico. Next one, please. The lockdowns, let's go to the next one, because the lockdowns, the important thing with the lockdowns is how much you actually reduce mobility. You see that, for example, in Peru, this is the work we're doing with Grand Data as UNDP, in which we're looking at digital sources to see how people are moving. So originally, for example, in Peru, you managed to reduce mobility almost by 70%, but people get tired and they start going out, right? So on average, for Lima, you had even 42% in the recent weeks of mobility reduction, but in the rest of the, for the whole country, it was less. It was like 32%. And if you go to poorest regions, actually the reduction is as small as 6% or so. So the poorest, the poorer the region, the lower the change in mobility. And that means that the economics and the health situation there interact very closely. The next one, please. The next one, this is just to show you how much the lack of connectivity affects the possibility to continue working or to continue in the education. This is the poorest people in Panama, for example. I mean, the gap between the poorest and the richest people in terms of having a desktop is 30%. The Dominican Republic is 32%. By the way, UNDP now is going to be helping the Dominican Republic, hopefully, to close this gap. But, you know, the gaps are really, really huge. Next one, please. I'm going to, next one, because I think all this is a bit repetitive and we want to conclude. Let's go to the next one. Let's go to, exactly, to policy priorities. One point on the way forward, and I end here. I stop here. The next one, please. So we know that as a region, we need to have this 3-lane road, as we call it, productivity, inclusion, and resilience, in order to, to break the productivity threshold for those who are vulnerable. to include everybody in the social protection systems, education, and so on as well, and to make people and households and economies more resilient. And that can only be achieved through better functioning of government. Next one, please. Finally, this is really the last one. The four main areas in which UNDP is working towards recovery, or what we call beyond recovery, is better social protection systems, hopefully with a more universal focus, better governance, to rethink the connection between citizens and governments, the digital disruption to affect education, health, financial inclusion, and so on, and try to find sustainable engines of growth through natural capital and climate action. So with this, I close because this is really a completely different subject, but I just wanted to make my pitch about what we are doing at UNDP. But certainly the main point here is how important all this notion of vulnerability became in the context of COVID, and in a way, how much we already knew about how vulnerable the region was, and yet we didn't manage to put in place all the systems to protect people under these conditions. Sorry for taking so long. I close here. We have still almost 20 minutes for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Luis. Felipe, this is really a very rich presentation and lots of food for thought from conceptual ideas of the middle class. I find the economic security approach to middle class extremely appealing, and I think that's I personally really like the concepts, and then also your presentation on the situation in Latin America, and really pinpointing the critical issues in Latin America and the policy direction to move forward. I would open the floor for discussion. That right now I have not seen. I hope that colleagues who have questions would use the chat box. Julie, that's how we do it, right? People can type their questions in the chat box. I can read out the questions, or we can open the mic for people to, if they raise their hands, we can.
Sure, they can put them in either the chat box or Q&A. That's fine. We can see them both.
Okay.
Looks like something's come through.
Yes, we have. Okay. Let me start with the. Okay. The first question. Maybe I can read out the questions. The first question is the model that's presented is based on the data for early 2000. Do the $10 a day still protect against poverty in the current situation? And in other words, can we still talk about the economically secure middle class, at $10 a day? That's a question. And another is, do we have a sense of how much the changes in the middle class in Latin America is due to flows in and out of the lower income segments versus the upper income segments, going in and out of the upper income segments? And how does this vary among the countries, and what kind of policy implications there might be? So we start with those two.
Excellent. These two questions are very good because they allow me to expand a little bit. So the first one on the model, I think the question is really right. I mean, it touches really one of the main issues, and that's why in my presentation I said, similar to poverty, the notion of middle class that I presented is absolute in the realm of the functioning that defines it, the economic security, but relative in terms of the context. So indeed, the idea is to keep updating. So that's why the exercise we did in Europe was precisely to look at a period before the beginning of, until 2000 or so, and then after, particularly after the crisis, the 2008 financial crisis. And we did find that there is a shift in terms of this relation between probability and income that I presented. So that is the type of exercise that we should be doing whenever possible, relatively in a sort of permanent basis. So what is shown in that case is that indeed you would need a little bit higher of a threshold. I mean, for example, something like 13, 14, which is what actually was used finally in the report on the social contract in Europe. So the idea was precisely to update that line. So for Latin America, we would like to update that line. We don't know the answer whether it will be lower or higher. And there are reasons to go both ways, because one possibility is that it goes up because it becomes more expensive to protect against shocks. But think of a situation where markets are developed and it becomes cheaper to protect against shocks. So it could be actually lower. Conceptually, that is possible. So it's an empirical question. The only issue with that is that for that you need panel data, because as you saw in the first step of the methodology, you need to construct the transition matrices. And for those transition matrices, you do need panel data, and few countries, in the case of LAC, have panel data. So now we need it for Chile, for Peru, for Mexico. There are now also panel data. There is for Brazil recently. There are other countries, Nicaragua has some panel data. So there is a possibility, but again, you would need that. The second question is more related to whether it is at the bottom or at the top. And that allows me to say two things. So one is you can find a sort of a poverty gap, the inverse of a poverty gap, which is something we also estimated at that time in 2012 or so, which is looking at, in the same way that you look at how far the poor people are from the threshold, which is the poverty line, you can see how far the middle class is from being poor in terms of a gap. And if that gap has increased, you would assume that those people are economically more secure, rather than insecure if they are vulnerable but very close to the poverty line. So you can do that kind of analysis. My hypothesis in the case of LAC is that a lot of the redistribution that we saw during the first 2 decades, I mean, or at least first 15, or I would say 2002 to 2016, there is redistribution through cash transfer programs and so on. My hypothesis is that it didn't really touch the really top of the distribution. It was not a redistribution from the top to the bottom, but rather it was a redistribution from the middle class to the poor, even if it's not formally redistributing through transferring of income, it's at the margin making budgetary decisions that instead of going to provide services and so on for the middle class, they went to provide cash transfers for the poor. So the rich untouched, middle class being sort of more vulnerable because of this, and the poor receiving these transfers made a situation, is a hypothesis again, in which the urban middle classes became completely disengaged and disenchanted with the political system. But that's again a hypothesis.
Thank you very much. We have more questions. One of the question from the audience is, have you compared the results of your definition of middle class more based on economic security with other concepts that's more based on income, wealth, and consumption patterns? What if you have, what's the difference? And
I mean, it's consistent in terms of the trends, perhaps not in terms of the levels, one thing. Second,
yes,
ECLAC has typically relied more. There's very good work done by ECLAC on occupational status, mobility based on occupational status. and I already gave my opinion on that work. It's useful in certain ways, but not for what I wanted to do. Third is that also ECLAC has used relative measures. Some of the references I gave on relative measures are precisely work that was done through ECLAC in past, I think it was in the 90s and early 2000s. So it's a relative measure. So in that sense, again, the trends could be similar, but the levels are different. And think of this, in our case, the threshold to become middle class is around the 66th percentile. So one of the main findings of this approach is that the middle class in the economic security sense, these are people who are not in the middle of the distribution. And that is the discrepancy between relative and absolute. And one indicator I at some point proposed, but I never explored, is that the overlap between relative and absolute measures could be actually an indicator of the stability of the stability of the middle class. And as you develop, there will be more overlap between those two. But yeah, I mean, in that sense, there is a little bit of a difference again in terms of the levels, but not necessarily in terms of the trends. Final point: if you look at consumption, and I understand why, because of the status element and so on, you may want to use consumption. The problem is that during consumption booms, like the one that took place in LAC during the commodity boom, that might be misleading. And that's something that was also used in Mexico, because consumption overshoots through, for example, credit to consumption via credit cards and so on. I always cite the former minister of Brazil, who said during those times, 2014, when we presented the report, he said, Brazilians are buying things they don't need with money they don't have to impress people they don't know. So if you look at consumption, I mean, it describes a little bit this process in which through consumption, it could be a little bit misleading and less sustainable. That's why I have my concerns about using consumption. But maybe, let's go to other questions. Otherwise, I keep talking.
No, you should keep talking because it's really interesting. I just find, what you mentioned, the overlap between the absolute measure and the relative, the vulnerability measure being an indicator of how stable the middle class. I found that extremely intriguing. Anyway, we have more questions, so I shouldn't abuse my position as a moderator to dwell too much into my personal interest. So here, the next question is that you just mentioned that the cash transfer programs and being used to using resources, taxes from middle class to basically subsidize, support people living in poverty. It has the political backlash, right? So in your view, are there more progressive forms of redistribution that politically might be feasible in the region, in LAC?
So I think that is, I would say two things about that. First, I believe, of course, in progressive income taxation, very progressive income taxation. And I said income, not necessarily wealth, which is more complicated, but wealth mainly through property. OECD countries collect around 4% of GDP in property taxes. In Latin America, the average is even lower than 1%. So that is one important way in which you can tax wealth, and it's quite progressive. So that, I would argue, is feasible, but also depends on the political cycle and so on, because they typically rely on local governments, and local governments don't want to lose elections. So that's an important issue. So I believe in income taxation being very progressive, but it's always complicated. But more important, I think it's something that we are going to be proposing in our regional human development report to come out in a few months, which is one way to redistribute is to establish universal social protection packages. I mean, if you have disability, pension, unemployment, I'm talking about insurance, no, disability insurance, basic pension, unemployment insurance, health, pension, and so on, in a package, and you offer that universally, independently of your job status, and you finance that through general taxation, then the overall system becomes more progressive, even when the consumption taxes are not progressive. If you redistribute in that way, you can boost employment, and at the same time, because you reduce the cost of hiring formally, and at the same time, you can have better protection for all. So you unify the quality and the universality of the social protection package while you unify the financing of that package, and then you stop having these dual systems. For me, that is the way, and we're trying to come up with better arguments to make that point. And I think that is a very important way in which the distribution can take place, and you can make everybody more economically secure in a way.
Thank you. Yes, actually, the issue of universal social protection or universal basic social protection floor is indeed one of the policy measures or policy platforms that that we in DESA, in the Secretariat, had also been focusing on in our policy analysis and policy recommendations. I think that just here, I just want to jump in to say that, you know, there's also literature showing that when the benefits is universal, even though the upper class or the richer people, they don't necessarily need the benefits or depend on the benefits, right? But at least they are also not eligible, but they, you know, it's also benefits that's available to them, that in some countries that have been shown that the political support for this kind of programs is actually increased, because it's not viewed as subsidizing only the poor, or, you know, providing taking from the richer people to subsidize the poor.
Do you mind if I comment on that? Do you mind if I comment on that? Because I think what I'm talking here is a universal social protection package that includes basic pension, disability insurance, health insurance, potential unemployment, that is financed through general taxes. And it might include, and I would argue it should include, an income guarantee for people who fall below a certain threshold. So I'm talking about that. I understand your point about the universal basic income. But my only point is that these are two different things. I'm talking about universal social protection package that includes services like health, like pensions and so on. And my only point there, and I'm not going to get into, I'm not opposing to universal basic income here. I'm just saying that what I'm suggesting is different. And it might include, again, a basic income guarantee, is that if you give the universal basic income, you have to make sure that is not instead of full access to quality services for all, but it's in addition to. And that is very important because we have relied in Latin America and Korea a lot on cash transfers, and the quality of public services has deteriorated because of the fiscal space that is not as big as one would like to. And that has led, you know, some people have called this the commoditization of opportunity. If you rely only on income transfers, then it's up to the market for people to go and buy the services or buy the opportunities. And that can lead to this commoditization of opportunities and may actually exacerbate inequalities. Of course, I'm talking about a very specific thing that might not necessarily happen, but I have, I mean, universal basic income is a discussion that I would like to eventually also have my opinion on, but my point is this is a bit different.
Thank you for your clarification, for your response. And a quick question about the data and analysis that you have presented. Do you have breakdowns by gender? For instance, analysis looking into the middle class versus poor families. You know, they are headed by women, for instance.
Yes, and people, I mean, vulnerable population, women tend to be overrepresented in vulnerable population. That's perhaps the main way to say, the best way to say it. Why? Because women tend to have more precarious jobs. Some of the elements that we showed in the profile are associated with the vulnerability of women in lack, a lower level of participation and so on. So in a way, we can say that particularly being middle class is a particularly difficult achievement for women in lack. I don't know in other regions, but the data certainly for lack shows that women are more vulnerable than men in the case of Latin American Caribbean.
Thank you. I know I recognize that we are mainly because I don't want to take too much of your time. I understand that commitments to share your insight with us, and we don't want to abuse the the goodwill. If I may mention one more question that relates to digital connectivity and access to devices, especially in the context of response to COVID-19, and access to digital platforms and devices becomes a necessity, right? In terms of being able to continue to learn, to work, if that's possible. How has UNDP planning in its own policy some ways to kind of address the digital divide and to kind of push government, if possible.
Right. Very good point. And yes, one of the 4 pillars that I showed is precisely digital, what we call digital transformation. So just to mention a few areas, one is digital transformation for education inclusion. So we are just discussing this, for example, in the Dominican Republic, how we can help the government to increase coverage and so on. But in general, in Colombia, there is this program called Connectivity is Equity. The idea is, so that's one element. The other is related to the possibility actually for labor force participation. And you can do it better. I mean, there are many more options if you have connectivity. So that's another aspect. So the income generation capacity can improve. But the other is also access to finance. As you know, yesterday, there was this pre-launch and the report of the Secretary General on digital finance has been launched. And as you know, the UNDP administrator was a co-chair of that panel that launched the report. And it's very important, particularly in the case of what we're discussing, because vulnerability has to do with capacity to protect ourselves against shocks. And access to finance is a fundamental instrument of protection in that sense. So that's another very key aspect in which digital inclusion is related to vulnerability. So we see this as a very, very important area in our work. Yes.
Thank you. I acknowledge that we just come to the 1 hour of our reserved time for the platform. Let me see if I have any urgent burning questions coming from the audience. If not, I also like I said, I know that you are also very busy. You have other responsibilities, so we are very, very grateful for you taking time out to have this dialogue with us, and we also look forward to seeing the reports that you mentioned, and also we also look forward to collaboration and continued dialogue in the preparation of our report. So I find myself in a challenging position, that is to try to summarize such a rich presentation and discussion at the end. So my excuse is that I have no time to take up this challenge.
Thank you, Wenyan. Really, thank you. It's a very refreshing opportunity for me. and very interesting questions. And all this helps to strengthen our work in UNDP. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, and we look forward to continued collaboration. And we know, as we were talking to your colleague, we know where you work, so we will be reaching out to you. And you also, obviously, you also know where we work. We are located, so we look forward to future collaboration. And thank you once again very much for taking time out to share your insights.
Thank you, and thank you to all of those who actually took the time to join. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. And now we close the webinar for now. But our conversation and dialogue will continue in another time with more speakers, and also we hopefully can welcome you back to our webinar series. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye bye.